Clara Hastings was the kind of teacher everyone trusted, admired by parents, adored by students, and respected by colleagues. But when her secret affair with 18-year-old Ethan Ward turned into an obsession, admiration gave way to madness. And when jealousy over another student, Lucy Barrett, took hold, a forbidden love story spiraled into one of the most shocking murders ever to shake the quiet town of Norfolk. Please subscribe for daily new update of crime story and watch till end. Clara Hastings had always been the pride of the small town of Norfolk. She lived in a neat ivy-covered cottage on the edge of town, a place that reflected the order and calm she projected in her life. To her students at Oakfield Grammar School, she was the ideal teacher, patient, well-spoken, and effortlessly graceful. She had a reputation for making literature come alive, turning dull pages into vivid worlds that her students loved exploring. Her colleagues often admired her dedication, unaware that behind the polite smiles and warm greetings was a woman slowly losing herself to loneliness. For most of her adult life, Clara had followed rules and expectations. She had graduated from a respected university, earned her teaching credentials, and returned to her hometown to give back to the community that had once nurtured her dreams. But as the years went by, her life began to feel smaller, more confined. Her friends married, moved away, or built families of their own. Clara, however, remained alone, convincing herself that her career was enough. Yet, late at night, when she sat alone marking essays with the sound of rain against her window, a deep emptiness settled inside her. It was an ache she could not name, one that made her long for excitement, for someone to see her not as Miss Hastings the teacher, but simply as Clara. She carried this loneliness quietly, dressing it in the disguise of professionalism. Every morning she arrived at school early, her hair perfectly tied, her lesson plans neatly arranged, her smile rehearsed. To everyone around her, she seemed content. But inside she was unraveling. She felt trapped between the walls of her classroom, day after day repeating the same lessons, surrounded by young faces full of dreams she no longer believed in for herself. Her students adored her. They found comfort in her calmness and admired how she treated them like equals. Parents praised her ability to connect with teenagers who often struggled with authority. That admiration became a lifeline for Clara, a quiet addiction that made her feel valued again. Every compliment, every note of gratitude from a student, filled the hollow space inside her. It wasn't about romance or desire then. It was about being noticed, about feeling alive in a world that had grown dull and gray. In the staff room, she listened to other teachers talk about their families and weekend plans, smiling politely while hiding the sting of envy. At home she would scroll through old photos, remembering a version of herself that once laughed easily and believed in happy endings. Somewhere along the way she had become a ghost of that woman. Her life was defined by order and repetition, until the day she met a student who unknowingly reignited something dangerous within her. When Ethan Ward entered her classroom, Clara didn't see him as just another student. There was something in his confidence, his easy charm, and his curiosity that drew her in instantly. For the first time in years, she felt a spark, something thrilling, forbidden, and entirely out of her control. It was the beginning of a secret that would soon consume her life and lead her down a path darker than anyone could have imagined. The town of Norfolk would remember Clara Hastings, not as the teacher who inspired minds, but as the woman whose longing for connection led to a nightmare no one saw coming. Ethan Ward was the kind of student every teacher noticed. He was sharp, confident, and carried himself with a maturity that made him stand out among his classmates. At 18, he was in his final year at Oakfield Grammar, preparing for university. His essays were thoughtful, his questions insightful, and Clara Hastings found herself looking forward to his classes more than she cared to admit. It began innocently, extra tutoring after school, discussions about literature that stretched beyond the bell, shared jokes about poetry that no one else understood. To anyone watching, it looked like a dedicated teacher helping a promising student reach his potential. But beneath that innocent exterior, something far more dangerous was beginning to form. Clara started to notice Ethan outside the classroom, the way he smiled when he passed her in the hallway, how his confidence seemed to brighten even her dullest days. It thrilled her to think that someone younger, full of life and ambition, saw her not just as a teacher but as a person. She began to linger after lessons, tidying her desk a little slower, waiting to see if he would stay behind to talk. When he did, their conversations drifted from schoolwork to personal dreams, music, and books. Clara felt a warmth she hadn't felt in years, a connection that filled the emptiness she had been trying so hard to ignore. It wasn't long before she began finding excuses to spend more time with him. She volunteered to supervise his independent study projects, offered to review his essays personally, and arranged after-school sessions that stretched late into the evening. Ethan didn't resist. In fact, he seemed to enjoy the attention. For him, it was flattering to be singled out by a respected teacher. For Clara, it became an obsession, each encounter feeding a growing attachment she could no longer control. What started as admiration slowly blurred into something deeper and far more dangerous. One evening during a quiet tutoring session in her classroom, a small moment changed everything. Ethan had been struggling with a passage from a Shakespeare play. When he finally understood it, Clara felt a surge of pride, and without thinking, she placed her hand on his. The gesture was brief, but it lingered between them like a secret. They both knew a line had been crossed. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face. Her rational mind screamed at her to stop, to remember who she was, and what was at stake, but her heart, that lonely, aching heart, ignored every warning. Their meetings became more secretive. Text replaced emails, and late-night messages turned into clandestine meetings in quiet cafes outside town. Clara knew it was wrong, yet she convinced herself that love made it right. She began to believe that Ethan understood her in ways no one else ever had. What she didn't know was that Ethan's attention wasn't hers alone. Another student, Lucy Barrett, had also fallen under his charm. Clara's fragile fantasy was about to shatter, and when it did, the consequences would be deadly. Rumors at Oakfield Grammar began quietly, as they always did. Whispers in the corridors, side glances in the cafeteria, and hushed laughter behind closed doors. Students noticed how often Clara Hastings and Ethan Ward were seen together, the way he lingered in her classroom after lessons, the occasional car ride home when it rained. At first it was nothing more than idle gossip, the kind that flickered and faded in a few days, but this time it didn't fade. It grew, spreading like a shadow over Clara's reputation. Teachers started to exchange wary looks. Some suspected something inappropriate but dismissed it for lack of proof. Clara told herself she didn't care. What she had with Ethan was real, at least that's what she believed. Ethan, however, had begun to drift away. The charm that once drew Clara in was now directed elsewhere. He was young, impulsive, and hungry for attention, and he found a new source of it in Lucy Barrett. Lucy was different, quiet, shy, the kind of girl who blended into the background. She admired Ethan from afar, never imagining he would notice her. When he did, it felt like a dream. Their connection grew in secret, built on stolen moments and whispered confessions. Lucy had no idea about his involvement with Clara. To her, Ethan was kind and sincere, but Ethan was juggling two dangerous relationships without realizing the storm he was creating. Clara soon noticed the change. Ethan's messages became shorter, his visits less frequent. He no longer lingered after class. When she asked about it, he brushed her off with excuses about exams and university applications. But Clara wasn't fooled. Her instincts, sharpened by loneliness and obsession, told her something was wrong. One evening, scrolling through social media, she found a photo that shattered her illusion completely. It was Ethan and Lucy, smiling at a cafe table, their faces lit with the easy warmth of young love. Clara felt her chest tighten. The world around her seemed to tilt. In that moment, the woman who once prided herself on control began to unravel. Her thoughts grew darker each day. She convinced herself that Lucy had stolen Ethan away, that she had manipulated him, taken advantage of his youth. Clara started watching Lucy at school, observing her every move. She noticed the way Lucy's expression changed when Ethan walked by, the shy smiles they shared, the notes exchanged in class. Each sighting deepened her fury. What began as heartbreak turned into jealousy, and jealousy soon morphed into something far more sinister. She began to act on her impulses in small ways, deleting Lucy's essays from shared drives, spreading subtle rumors, even following her after school. Clara's obsession consumed her completely. She no longer cared about her reputation, her job, or the consequences. All that mattered was Ethan. She wanted him back, no matter the cost. In her mind, Lucy wasn't just another student, she was the enemy, the reason her perfect secret world was falling apart. The woman once seen as calm and collected had become someone else entirely, desperate, unpredictable, and dangerous. It was only a matter of time before jealousy turned into violence, and the first dark step toward murder was taken. The night it all changed began like any other. Cold wind sweeping across the Norfolk countryside, rain tapping lightly against the windows of Clara's small home. She had spent the entire day in restless agitation, replaying every moment she had seen Ethan and Lucy together. By the time she invited Ethan over that Friday evening, her thoughts were no longer guided by reason, but by desperation. She told herself it was only to talk, to understand why he had drifted away. But deep inside, she knew she wanted more than answers. She wanted control again, and she was willing to do anything to get it. Ethan arrived shortly after sunset, his car headlights slicing through the mist as he parked outside her cottage. He stepped in, expecting to discuss his university recommendation letter, unaware of the storm that was waiting behind her calm smile. Clara had set the table neatly, made tea, and arranged his papers in a tidy stack, but her hands trembled slightly as she poured his drink. She tried to act normal, yet every word from him felt like a lie, every polite smile felt like mockery. When she casually mentioned Lucy's name, Ethan froze. It was all the confirmation she needed. He tried to explain, to dismiss it as harmless, but the buzzing of his phone interrupted him. On the screen flashed Lucy's name with a heart beside it. Something inside Clara shattered. The air around them turned heavy, charged with fury and betrayal. For years she had controlled every detail of her life, keeping her emotions hidden beneath a layer of composure. But now, her restraint dissolved completely. Every ounce of heartbreak, jealousy, and rage erupted all at once. The neat, disciplined teacher was gone. What stood in her place was a woman undone. The confrontation escalated rapidly. Ethan's voice rose, pleading for her to calm down, but she was beyond reason. Her mind blurred between love and hatred, between wanting to hold him and wanting to erase him forever. Neighbors later recalled hearing raised voices, a sharp crash, then silence. When dawn broke, the streets were quiet, and no one thought much of it. Ethan's parents began to worry when he didn't return home that night. His car was still parked near Clara's lane, but there was no sign of him. Clara, meanwhile, arrived at school the next morning, as if nothing had happened. Her hair was neatly tied, her clothes pressed, though her hands shook slightly when she handed out papers. She joined the teachers in their morning meeting, pretending concern when Ethan's absence was mentioned. Within hours, the police were informed. They began searching the nearby woods, rivers, and fields. Clara was interviewed like everyone else, her calm demeanor earning no suspicion at first. But as the days passed, cracks began to show. Her story changed slightly each time she was asked when she last saw Ethan. Her colleagues noticed her eyes seemed distant, her expression empty. Beneath her tidy exterior, panic was setting in. She had crossed a line that could never be undone. What had started as a forbidden romance had turned into something irreversible, and the darkness she had unleashed was only just beginning to unfold. 3 days after Ethan's disappearance, the peaceful town of Norfolk awoke to horror. A jogger, running along the wooded path near the outskirts of Norwich, noticed something unusual: disturbed soil, and a faint smell that made him stop in his tracks. What he discovered would unravel everything. Buried shallow beneath the earth was the lifeless body of Ethan Ward. His face was bruised, his clothes torn, and there were marks on his wrists that told a story of violence and panic. News of the discovery spread rapidly, shaking the quiet community to its core. Students cried in the hallways, teachers stood in stunned silence, and police descended on the area with urgency. For many, the idea that one of their own could be the victim of such brutality felt impossible. But for the detectives, one name soon stood out among their list of people to question: Clara Hastings. Investigators noticed immediately that Clara's behavior didn't align with her words. She had joined in the community's grief, sending a message of condolence to Ethan's parents, offering to help the school organize a memorial. But beneath her calm exterior, detectives saw a flicker of something off: her lack of genuine emotion, her overly rehearsed statements, and her nervous hands when she was asked simple questions. They began to dig deeper into her connection with Ethan, reviewing records, school CCTV, and witness testimonies. It didn't take long before red flags emerged. Clara had been seen frequently with Ethan outside school, often late in the evening. One student even claimed to have spotted Ethan's car parked near her home on several occasions. Then came the damning evidence. When forensic teams examined Ethan's belongings, they found traces of Clara's DNA on his clothing and personal items. Even more telling was a silver bracelet discovered near the shallow grave, engraved with the initials C. Confronted with this, Clara claimed it had been stolen months earlier, a claim detectives found suspicious. They obtained a search warrant for her house, and what they found added to the growing case against her. In a drawer beside her bed were several printed photos of Ethan, taken during class trips and events. Some were ordinary group shots, but others appeared more personal, candid moments of him looking away, unaware of the camera. It painted a picture not of a teacher mourning a student, but of a woman fixated on him. The forensic report later confirmed the cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head. The weapon was never found, but the injuries suggested a violent outburst rather than a premeditated act. Detectives believed the confrontation had turned deadly in the heat of the moment. What Clara thought she could control had spiraled into chaos. As the evidence mounted, she tried to maintain her innocence, presenting herself as a victim of malicious rumors. Yet every piece of proof told a different story. When the press began covering the case, the community's faith in her shattered completely. The perfect image of Miss Hastings, the kind, intelligent teacher, was gone. What remained was a shadow of the woman she once was, now caught in a web of lies, deceit, and a murder she could no longer hide from. Just as the police were preparing to finalize their case against Clara Hastings, another tragedy struck that pushed the investigation into darker territory. Lucy Barrett, the quiet student who had once been close to Ethan, was reported missing by her parents. She hadn't returned home from school on a Wednesday evening, and her phone had gone silent. Panic swept through the town once again. Many feared a killer was still at large. Others whispered that Lucy's disappearance was somehow connected to Ethan's murder. When police traced Lucy's last known movements, they discovered she had been seen leaving the school grounds alone, heading in the direction of the same wooded area where Ethan's body had been found. The pattern was chillingly familiar. Detectives immediately turned their attention back to Clara. They had already been suspicious of her inconsistent behavior, but now, the timing of Lucy's disappearance was too coincidental to ignore. When questioned, Clara claimed she had no recent contact with Lucy and insisted she barely knew her outside the classroom. Yet, witnesses soon contradicted her story. One student recalled seeing Clara and Lucy in a heated conversation behind the school gym days earlier. Another mentioned spotting Clara's car parked near Lucy's neighborhood. The more detectives probed, the more her lies began to unravel. Search teams combed through the woodland again, this time with drones and canine units. After 2 tense days, their worst fears were confirmed. Lucy's body was discovered in a hidden clearing, not far from where Ethan had been found. Her injuries were brutal, and the scene suggested the same kind of rage-driven violence. It was a devastating moment for the community, and an even more damning one for Clara. Forensic evidence soon revealed traces of Lucy's blood in the trunk of Clara's car, along with small fibers matching the teacher's coat. A strand of Clara's hair was also found on Lucy's clothing. These findings left no room for coincidence. Investigators pieced together what they believed had happened. After killing Ethan in a fit of jealousy, Clara realized Lucy knew too much. Lucy had confided in friends that she suspected something was wrong with her teacher and that she intended to go to the authorities. Before she could, Clara acted first. Detectives theorized that Clara had lured Lucy into meeting her under the pretense of talking things through after Ethan's death. Once isolated in the woods, the confrontation turned violent. Clara's obsession had shifted from love to destruction, and now she was determined to erase anything that could expose her. When police confronted her with the forensic results, Clara's composure finally cracked. Her calm tone turned defensive. Her story changed repeatedly, and she grew visibly agitated during questioning. The evidence was overwhelming. She had gone from a respected teacher to the prime suspect in a double homicide. The town was left in disbelief as the truth emerged. The woman who once inspired trust and admiration had descended into darkness. Every attempt to cover her tracks had only tied the noose tighter around her. The tragedy that began with a secret affair had spiraled into a nightmare of lies, jealousy, and murder, and Clara Hastings was now the center of it all. When detectives finally decided to make their move, it was a gray morning that seemed to mirror the heaviness in the air. Clara Hastings was at home, sitting in the same tidy kitchen where she had once shared tea with Ethan. She had barely slept for days, her mind trapped between fear and denial. The knock on the door came just after sunrise, 3 sharp raps that made her flinch. Outside stood 2 officers, their expressions unreadable. They asked her to accompany them to the station for further questioning. Clara tried to remain calm, clutching her cardigan around her shoulders, but her heart was pounding. She knew this wasn't just another interview. The illusion she had built around herself was finally collapsing. At the police station, Clara was led into a small, sterile room. On the table sat files, photographs, and evidence bags. Silent witnesses to everything she had done. The detectives laid out the items one by one: the bracelet found at Ethan's grave, Lucy's blood traces from her car, and the journal they had taken from her bedroom. Inside that journal were pages filled with her handwriting, letters she had written to Ethan, obsessive entries describing her feelings, and disturbing confessions about jealousy and control. There were even torn photographs of Lucy scribbled over in anger. Each piece of evidence stripped away another layer of her carefully crafted image. At first, Clara denied everything. She claimed she was being framed, that students were spreading lies to ruin her reputation. But the detectives didn't back down. They read aloud text messages exchanged between her and Ethan, messages that revealed not only their affair but also her growing desperation when he tried to end it. The silence in the room grew heavier with every word. Then came the most damning evidence: CCTV footage from a petrol station near the woods on the night of Lucy's disappearance. It showed Clara's car passing through around the same time Lucy's phone stopped transmitting. That moment broke her. Her hands trembled, and her eyes filled with tears that weren't from sorrow but from sheer panic. The truth had finally cornered her. Hours passed before she spoke again. When she did, her voice was quiet, almost detached. She confessed to it all: how the affair had begun, how she had lost control the night Ethan confronted her, and how fear drove her to silence Lucy. She described it as if it were someone else's story, a distant nightmare she was forced to recount. Her words painted a chilling picture of obsession turned to madness. She said she hadn't planned to kill either of them, but once the first act of violence was done, she felt trapped. "It was supposed to stay between us," she whispered, staring at the floor. When the confession ended, the detectives exchanged grim looks. There was no satisfaction in solving the case, only a hollow understanding of how easily love could twist into horror. Clara Hastings was arrested, and charged with 2 counts of murder. As she was led out of the station, cameras flashed, reporters shouted her name, and the people who once admired her turned away in disbelief. Her life as a respected teacher had ended. Now she was a symbol of betrayal and tragedy, the woman who had let passion destroy everything in its path. The trial of Clara Hastings began 6 months after her arrest, and by then her name had become infamous across the United Kingdom. Every newspaper headline carried her story, the teacher who had crossed forbidden lines and committed unthinkable crimes. The courtroom in Norwich was filled each day with reporters, spectators, and families seeking closure. Behind the glass barrier, Ethan's and Lucy's parents sat silently, their grief etched across their faces. Clara appeared in court wearing a simple gray suit, her once well-kept hair now dull, her expression hollow. The calm confidence that once defined her was gone, replaced by an emptiness that made her almost unrecognizable. Prosecutors presented a timeline of obsession that spanned months. They showed messages between Clara and Ethan that revealed how their relationship evolved from flirtation to dependency, and finally, to violence. They demonstrated how Clara's jealousy spiraled after discovering Ethan's involvement with Lucy, and how she planned meetings with both students under false pretenses. The evidence was undeniable: fingerprints, DNA, journal entries, and her own confession. The prosecution painted her as a manipulative predator who used her position of authority to exploit her students before turning into a murderer when she lost control. The defense tried to argue that Clara's mental state had deteriorated over time, that loneliness and emotional instability had clouded her judgment. They described her as a broken woman, desperate for affection, who acted in a moment of madness rather than with malice. But even as her lawyers spoke, Clara sat motionless, staring ahead as if she were detached from the reality around her. There was no spark of defiance, no tears, only a quiet resignation. It was as if she had already accepted her fate. When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom was silent. The jury took just over 4 hours to find her guilty on both counts of murder. The judge's words were sharp and deliberate as he sentenced her to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 25 years. He called her actions a grotesque abuse of trust, and said that her crimes had destroyed not only 2 young lives, but the faith of an entire community. As the sentence was read, a quiet gasp rippled through the gallery. Ethan's mother wept softly, holding Lucy's father's hand. Clara showed no visible reaction. She simply lowered her head, as though she already knew how the story would end. In prison, Clara was isolated for her own safety. Other inmates viewed her with disgust, a teacher who had betrayed her duty and killed the very people she was meant to protect. She rarely spoke, spending most of her time in her cell reading old novels, perhaps trying to find fragments of the life she once had. Outside, the small town of Norfolk tried to move on, but the memory of her crimes lingered. The school where she had once taught closed temporarily before reopening under a new name, its history scrubbed clean, though whispers of Clara Hastings' story still haunted its halls. Years later, her name remained a grim warning, a reminder of how quickly admiration could turn into obsession, and how love, when twisted by jealousy and control, could become deadly. Clara Hastings had once inspired minds. Now she stood as a cautionary tale carved into the dark chapters of British true crime.